Vasudevaya. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamstra Shri Rupam Sagajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Paridana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lita Shri Vishaka Vitamstra Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishwabhanu Sate Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Krupa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadesha Tarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, everyone. So, welcome to our continued study of Bhagavad Gita. So, we're discussing today the end of chapter 13. Again, the title is Nature, the Enjoyer and Consciousness. Nature is the material world that we are in. The enjoyer, we know who is the Purusha Paraha, that is Krishna, and consciousness, the living entity, Jiva. And this constitutes complete knowledge. So, as I mentioned last week, this is a little bit of a technical section of the Bhagavad Gita, but this chapter serves as the foundation for the rest of the Bhagavad Gita, chapters 14 through 17, before we get into 18, which is again a summary. So, we've been discussing these terms, the 6 terms, the Kshetra, Kshetragya, Prakriti, Purusha, Gyaya, and Jnana. And so these 6 come together to explain, the answers to how we have come into this material world, our position here, the cause of it, and ultimately the solution, the path back home, back to Godhead. So it's a very important chapter and section, though sometimes in its technicality we sometimes kind of move through it. But actually it serves as a great foundation of knowledge. So we'll conclude the last 9 verses here today. So in verse 27, Krishna is saying, O chief of Bharatas, know that whatever you see in existence, both the moving and the non-moving, is only a combination of the field of activities and the knower of the fields. So here Krishna is explaining that everything we see in the world, it's a combination of matter and spirit. Right? The field of activities is the Kshetra. And Krishna has previously explained that the Kshetra is comprised of the 24 elements. So this is matter. Right? This is all material elements. This body is just dead matter. It actually needs the combination or the inclusion of the spirit in order to give it life. Just like a car, it doesn't move unless there's a driver within it. Similarly, this body, this Kshetra, it is dead matter that becomes alive by the presence of the soul. So, but everything we see around us is either matter or spirit. And both of these are energies of the Supreme Lord. And Krishna has said that that these energies have existed eternally. Right? We saw last week that it is eternally existing. And so even before the creation of this material world, which then implies, again, that the spirit soul came from the spiritual world. Because the manifestations of these material universes are in a temporary form. They go through creation, maintenance, and destruction. But well before the existence of this is certainly the presence of the spirit soul. Okay? And Prabhupada comments in the purport that Krishna is the controller of both the material and spiritual nature. So this is a fact that we must understand and come to acknowledge. And this serves as the basis to solve our challenge in the material world, our embedment in this Prakriti. So we have seen earlier in chapter 7 a similar statement about how everything is, apara shakti. Right? Everything is part of his material or spiritual energy. And so this is not a new concept, but just again explaining again. We saw it in the first verse of Shri Upanishad, how everything animate or inanimate ultimately is coming from Krishna. So he opens this section with this statement. So in the 28th verse, we see, one who sees the supersoul accompanying the individual soul in all bodies, and who understands that neither the soul nor the supersoul within the destructive body is ever destroyed, actually sees. So now Krishna is going to speak about one who sees things as they are. So one who has the right vision. So what is the right vision? We may all observe things around us, and scientists are always, trying to explain what they see around us and try to understand the why and the how of everything. But here is actually the vision of truth, of reality, that Krishna is explaining. So here we see how to actually extricate the Kshetragya from the Kshetra. Right? This is very, very distinct. So going back to chapter 2, Krishna has spoken about the soul as never being destroyed, and that to see the soul and the super soul in every body. Okay, so this is, again, bringing back a topic that Krishna spoke earlier, but now in more detail. So who is in knowledge? Who has knowledge is one who sees these three things. The body, the Kshetra. 2, the proprietor of the body, the Jiva. And 3, the friend of the soul. And that's what Srila Prabhupada says in the purport. One who knows these three, we've been talking about these three since the beginning, it's also the title of the chapter, is in knowledge. And this knowledge, again, is what helps one achieve a better situation, a better outcome. And that's what we're all looking for, right? Some improvement. So this is the same as the perfect knowledge that we saw in the 3rd verse of this chapter. Okay, so. Now, how to get this knowledge, Srila Prabhupada says, anyone who by good association, so it is through association, and one who knows this knowledge can then come to it. To see this. One who has seen the truth can reveal it to us, as we saw in the 4th chapter. So needing association of a real knower is critical for us to be able to come to this knowledge. And Srila Prabhupada is our wonderful association to help make this information available to us. And how does this knowledge help us? That is the critical point. How does it help us? Well, we realize very clearly here that when we see the supersoul accompanying the soul in all bodies, immediately we understand, I am not this body. And we realize that I have an eternal relationship with that supersoul who is accompanying me. I have a relationship with Krishna. And when I understand that relationship, that sambandha, then I can act in that relationship. But if I don't see that relationship, I don't see that I'm connected to the supersoul, then I'll act in my relationship with the body. And thus, I suffer the consequences of this bodily designation, all of the attendant suffering and happiness that comes with it. So, this vision is very critical. And then the vision leads to action, and thus one achieves a better situation for themselves. Okay? So Krishna will continue this vision now in 29. One who sees the supersoul equally present everywhere in every living being does not degrade himself by his mind. Thus he approaches the transcendental destination. So now we see the ultimate benefit of knowing that the jiva and the supersoul are not destroyed, and that the supersoul is present everywhere. Right? One benefit is one does not degrade himself by his mind. And how does this happen? Well, the mind leads us to so many sinful activities. We attack other people, we attack other animals for satisfying the tongue, for whatever sense gratification, we're willing to step on others. We see abortions and murder and slavery and meat eating and, beating and all this stuff. It's all in reflection of neglecting the value of life. Knowing that the jiva and supersoul are present within all these lives. So one is degraded by the mind's desires to perform so many sinful activities. So, but when one realizes that the supersoul is present everywhere, it helps to control the mind. Because by seeing the supersoul everywhere, we don't have this destructive mentality. And we appreciate it. Wait, they're also part and parcel of Krishna. And Krishna himself has taken residence within this other body. And thus one becomes very peaceful to all around. And thus a very nice situation occurs. So we don't abuse one to gain some advantage. Give hardship to anybody. Because we see, no, the super soul is also present in that body. Is also a friend of that person. So I should also be friendly. So it creates a very peaceful existence amongst all in the world. This is the formula to world peace. Trying to arbitrate different, borders and trade secrets and, defense mechanisms. If we all seeing that the soul and super soul are within every body and the super soul is everywhere, it leads to the protection of the degradation of the mind. Because that degradation of the mind is what leads to such a destructive mentality. Right? And seeing the super soul everywhere, we are reminded that all the bad things that are happening to me, it's just due to my past actions. And so, there's no room for this blame. It's all self-responsibility. Right? I'm responsible for it. And so we don't take it out on others when we face our own difficult situations. Right? We know Super Soul is present everywhere. He's observing everything perfectly. And thus, whatever I'm facing, it must be just according to my past actions. Right? So Prabhupada says in this purport that the mind is generally addicted to sense-gratifying process. But when the mind turns to the super soul, one becomes advanced in spiritual understanding. So this is key. And Krishna gives the ultimate benefit, says, thus he approaches the transcendental destination. So this vision of knowing the distinction between body and soul, knowing the relationship between soul and super soul, it allows one to reach the supreme destination, which is full of bliss and happiness. The goal of every living entity in this world. So this Gyan leads to that outcome. So that is the great benefit of having this type of vision. 30, more vision. One who can see that all activities are performed by the body, which is created of material nature, and see that the self does nothing, actually sees. A bit of a tongue twister, but we've seen the same concept, right, before. That this verse is telling us who is the real doer. And we saw back the third chapter, Prakrute Priyamanani, Manai Karmani Sarvasha, Hankara Vimudatma Kartahamiti Manyate, right? No, it's the modes of material nature. Right? So the body is made by the modes of material nature. It is fashioning various types of bodies under the direction of the super soul. And whatever one is supposed to do, either for happiness or for distress, one is forced to do because of having acquired this kshetra, this body. But the jiva is separate from the body. Right? So the self is given this body. It occupies this residential quarters of this body, based on our past desires. Krishna, the super soul, is just fulfilling our past desires. And thus we're given so many different types of bodies to try to enjoy in different ways. So the desire leads to the body, which leads to us being the material nature, forcing us to act in different ways. And thus we see in this picture, we are being tossed left and right by the modes of material nature, simply fulfilling our various desires. But when one is transcended to the higher vision, then one sees the living entity is separate from this. And this is the real seer. Again, a topic Krishna has spoken over and over again. And sometimes we wonder, well, I'm stuck in this body. Am I destined for, suffering? Well, this body cast a certain future for us. In a prior purport, Prabhupada has said, once you obtain a certain residential quarter, you can't change it. If you're in a dog body, you must bark. That's it. There's no choice. That is your destination. But that is not your eternal destination. Based on the actions, you can change your future circumstance. Just like, we use a common example Prabhupada would give, that if you enter an airplane and that airplane is destined to London, well, now you're committed to going to London. The doors are locked and you're in the air. You can't do much about it. But what you do on that flight can determine what happens once you land. If you make some nice relationships with somebody on the plane and you strike up a great business deal, then you're now creating a new future. If you create some disturbance on the plane, some difficulties, well, then when you land, you'll be treated accordingly. So the interment segment of this journey is locked. We may be locked into this body for this period of time, but the decisions we make within it now will shape our future, our next outcomes. So it is not a permanent situation. So one who sees all of this, Krishna says, actually sees. And so we can see, actually, the world around us is blind to this very simple, basic topic. We are not this body, we are spirit, soul. And we have a relationship with Krishna. But the whole of the world is blind to this. And thus we see all the difficulties and suffering. Why there is so much turmoil? Because everybody is operating without vision. Imagine how much chaos there would be if we were all operating with our eyes closed. How would cars move on the road? Very nicely? No, it'd be chaos. Well, the chaos we see around us is simply due to the lack of this vision. Okay? Continuing this discussion of perfect vision. When a sensible man ceases to see different identities due to different material bodies, and he sees how beings are expanded everywhere, he attains to the Brahman conception. So, sees that the souls are same, have the same constitution. Makes no distinction between the bodies they have. Okay? Just simply, you don't judge your friends by the clothes they're wearing, you judge them by the person who they are. But the person who they are is the spirit soul. So taking that further, we don't judge the body of somebody. We understand, no, there is this presence of the spirit soul. So all bodies are just based on one's desires. But the soul within is the same. The body is independent of the jiva. And so what is this Brahman vision, this conception? Not seeing the Kshetra. One sees the Kshetra Jnana. That's what one sees. One doesn't see human, dog, demigod. That is material vision. That is seeing the clothes. One sees in vision the jiva. That is real vision. So one understands that there is a spirit soul. This is for real vision. More. Those with vision of eternity can see that the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. Despite contact with the material body, O Arjuna, the soul neither does anything nor is entangled. So we've talked about this previously. That one with vision sees that the soul is always pure. It is just a body that is interacting with the modes of nature based on the desires, doing so many things. But the soul does not engage in any material activities. And there's a very scientific reason why. Because the soul is spirit. It is part and parcel of Krishna. And just as Krishna does not interact with the modes, he remains completely aloof, then of course the spirit soul, being of the same composition, must have that same nature. Just like if water is wet, then any drop of water will also be wet. It has the same constitution. So because Krishna has no interaction with the modes, then of course the spirit soul, being part and parcel of Krishna, also has no interaction with the modes. So very simple logic. Okay? So how the soul becomes entrapped within the body, that is again due to the presence of the false ego. It covers the soul, and thus the mind then wanders freely and acts without concern for the soul. This happens until the intelligence gets control of the situation, controls the directions of the mind. The false ego then dissipates by the engagement of devotional service, and then the soul begins to shine through. But the soul is never contaminated by the modes of material nature. And we'll see this in the next verse. So with this vision, one knows never to engage themselves in material activities, knowing that I am spirit soul, which is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. So why bother with the lower modes when I have the opportunity to engage in the higher platform? One who has vision can see this. But unfortunately, if one doesn't see that the soul is in this pure state, one becomes entangled. But again, in the entangled mode, when we say conditioned by the modes, the soul remains pure. It is untouched. And so the example is given in the next verse of how the soul does not mix with the body, how it is eternally pure, never in contact. 33. The sky, due to its subtle nature, does not mix with anything, although it is all-pervading. Similarly, the soul situated in Brahman vision does not mix with the body, though situated in that body. So the soul, though it's encased within this body, is untouched. And Prabhupada uses a very elegant example of air. It can be in the midst of water, but that air pocket is untouched. It remains intact. Whether it's in water or mud or some dirty thing, it remains a pocket of air, untouched by whatever it's surrounded by. So similarly, the soul remains intact, untouched by the surrounding of the body, just as that air bubble, even though surrounded by mud, remains intact. So it's a nice way to understand how the soul is pure. And the key point here, again, is that matter doesn't mix with spirit. It is oil and water. Spirit mixes with spirit. Okay? So Krishna says that the soul situated in Brahman vision does not mix with the body. It understands, I am not this body. There's no identification with the body. I am separate and distinct. Okay? 34. O son of Bharata, as the sun alone illuminates all this universe, so does a living entity, one within the body, illuminate the entire body by consciousness. So this sun analogy, as the sun illuminates the whole universe, situated in one place, similarly the soul situated in the heart illuminates through consciousness the entire body. Again, second chapter, we heard about this consciousness. It says consciousness is the proof of the presence of the soul. And when there's no consciousness, there's no soul. Very simple. You know, just as when we see the sun rays, we know the sun is there. By the presence of sun rays, we know the sun is there. Similarly, by the presence of consciousness, we know the soul is there. So this is the symptom of the soul. It is consciousness. It is not a combination of matter. Matter is dead. It is inert. It doesn't move until it combines with the presence of the superior energy, spirit. Now the final verse in this chapter. Those who see with eyes of knowledge the difference between the body and the knower of the body can also understand the process of liberation from bondage and material nature, attain to the supreme goal. So here, again, the summary. By seeing the body and the soul, one can attain to the supreme goal. One can become free, liberated from material nature. So this is the key understanding for us, to know the distinction between one, the body, the kshetra, 2, the owner of that body, the jiva, the kshetragya, and 3, the supersoul. When one knows these 3 things in their proper constitution, then one can acquire a favorable outcome. You know, it's just like in anything, if you're trapped in a situation, you need to know the different processes to get out. You know, where in today's world, there's these, you know, escape rooms, and everybody enjoys. You get locked into a room, and then you have to assemble different things in order to get out. You know, bring different pieces of logic and use your intelligence and this clue and that clue, and then you escape. Well, this is the ultimate escape room. How to get out of the material world, where it's full of misery and suffering. Well, one must have knowledge, the clues, and put them together. And it all summarizes into knowing the nature, the body, the kshetra, knowing the jiva, distinct from that body, and knowing the relationship with the supersoul, which is present everywhere in our eternal relationship. Because as jiva, we can either relate with the body or we can relate with the supersoul. And based on that decision, there is an outcome awarded. If we relate with the body, we remain bonded to the material world. If we relate with the supersoul, we can become free from this bondage and achieve eternal bliss and happiness. So this is the critical fundamental point that Krishna made right in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. Right? And we know this is the foundational principle of our spiritual journey. And so how to acquire this knowledge, again, Srila Prabhupada says, that a faithful person should have good association to hear of God and thus gradually become enlightened. Krishna spoke in the 8th to 12th verses the processes of acquiring this knowledge, this humility, this steadfastness, the cleanliness, all these different processes, ultimately unalloyed devotion. Right? But it begins with this good association to come to the processes of knowledge. Right? And with knowledge, then we understand who is the real enjoyer. It is Krishna. He is the supreme enjoyer. Because the root cause of our becoming entrapped within the material world and this kshetra is confusing who is the Purusha. Our desire to be the independent Purusha has led to this circumstance. But when we understand who is the real enjoyer, then one can unlock the eternal solution to bliss and happiness. So we are an enjoyer, no doubt, but we are the dependent enjoyer. The eternal state of the spirit soul is to be happy, to enjoy. But one must know to enjoy with spirit, not try to enjoy with matter. Enjoying with matter will be the experience we have day in and day out. Enjoying with spirit, the supreme Purusha, one unlocks eternal bliss and happiness. But otherwise, we remain embedded within this nature, Prakriti, and remain stuck in this kshetra. So these are all how all the 6 terms interact. So I'll just read the last paragraph of the purport from Srila Prabhupada as a great summary. He says, one can understand that this body is matter and it can be analyzed with its 24 elements. The body is the gross manifestation, and the subtle manifestation is the mind and psychological effects. And the symptoms of life are the interactions of these features. But over and above this, there is the soul, and there is also the supersoul. The soul and supersoul are 2. The material world is working by conjunction of the soul and the 24 material element. One who can see the constitution of the whole material manifestation as the combination of the soul and material elements, and can also see the situation of the supreme soul, becomes eligible for transfer to the material, to the spiritual world. These things are meant for contemplation and for realization. One should have a complete understanding of this chapter with the help of the spiritual master. So the point here again is matter, soul, supersoul. These 3 things, we must understand it, but then it must come to realization, meaning acting in that knowledge. Then one can find perfection of life. And that is why this chapter is so important and is so appropriately named Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. It identifies these 3, again, over and over again, so we can embed them in our hearts and our minds and live our life understanding these three. So again, the technical foundation that was introduced at the very beginning of the second chapter is now explained in exhaustive detail in chapter 13. Krishna will expand upon this in the coming chapters with the modes of material nature, the divisions of faith, and different aspects, and ultimately bring us to the conclusion. And as we mentioned last time, the whole point of this detailed knowledge is simply inspire one to act in their eternal relationship with Krishna, render devotional service, surrender unto him. So to the extent we are not yet surrendered, this knowledge becomes helpful to explain the why and the why and the why of all these things. Okay? Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Any comments or questions today?
Hare Krishna, Dandavad Pranam.
Hare Krishna.
So first we are 13th chapter also. We are like, okay. So very nice explanation, Prabhuji, and I understand very well with respect to the matter, the body, Jiva and Paramatma. There are some questions with respect to the 13, 32, where we talked about the soul. So the question is like, if soul is not even interacting with the matter, not mixing with the matter, then how do soul experiencing all these things? Is soul not even experiencing?
No, it's experiencing it. It's along for the ride. Because of the presence of the false ego, the soul is along for the ride of the dictations of the mind. And so it is dragged into all of the different activities. And again, by the soul's initial desire, right? The jiva's initial desire to try to be independent of Krishna, to try to be spirit, the Purusha. So it is not forced upon the soul, it is by its desire. But through its desire, then, its experiences and interactions come from the interactions of the body. And so the pure consciousness of the soul is subdued. And we give the example of a diamond. A diamond's pure state is to shine and luster. But when that diamond is covered with mud, it doesn't shine because it's covered. So its nature does not manifest. But when you simply remove the mud, then that shine and sparkle comes back again. So similarly, the soul, it doesn't lose its nature, it's just simply covered. And what's that covering? The false ego. The identification with the body. And just recognize it's very subtle. Subtle means it's not so easy to grasp, right? Like how it actually works. It's subtle. Right? So it's difficult for us to understand, well then, is it me that's experiencing the body? Is it it's a very distinct and subtle point, but we can understand the concept. Ahankara vimudatma, right? Krishna said, by false ego, one thinks themselves the doer, meaning they identify with the body. So that's the separating feature. And what devotional service does, when we chant the holy names of the Lord, render service, what are we doing? We are chiseling away at that false ego. We're chiseling away at that mud that is caked around this beautiful diamond. Right? So, but we must remove it. So as we dissipate that false ego, that consciousness of the soul begins to permeate. So even within the body, in the embodied, liberated person, that sounds counterintuitive, right? Embodied, liberated person. But again, liberation is consciousness, not geography. Right? So that's how the pure devotee can also be in this bodied situation, but they don't identify with it because the soul is the consciousness, the pure consciousness is permeating without the presence of the false ego, just as a diamond without the presence of mud is shining. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hare Krishna. answer questions today?
Yeah, Prabhuji, Hare Krishna.
Yeah. Hare Krishna.
Yeah, very nice class, Prabhuji, technical also. Yeah. I'm just trying to understand, like, more, we are talking so much about the body, the soul, the super soul. So, basically, the soul is definitely a part and parcel of Krishna, it's a direct part of Krishna. So, the matter and the body is basically also Krishna's energy,
Mhm.
like.
Yes.
So, and despite the fact that we are actually surrounded in and out by Krishna, like soul is part and parcel of Krishna, this is Krishna's energy, but still that consciousness, the fact that about Krishna is nowhere there in the picture at all for us. So I mean, we are in and out of Krishna, correct?
Yes, and that is the purpose of Maya, illusion. Because we want to be independent of Krishna, but as you rightly said, we can't be. Everything we interact with is Krishna's energies, whether it's matter or spirit. So in order to create the appearance of us being separated from Krishna, again, based on our desire, there's a very strong illusion, right? A strong illusion is required to make something real that is not real. Sorry, make something appear real that is not real. So to make us appear as though we are not interacting with Krishna, the illusion has to be very strong. Because in reality, everything is apara or para shakti. Everything is Krishna's energy. So it's laughable or foolish for us to think, oh, how I can be independent of Krishna. But until one has this vision, they don't see it. And that vision is blocked by Maya. And that presence of Maya is simply due to our desire. So how to overcome Maya, this illusion? Simply desire. To have the right vision. It is our desire that brought us under the influence of Maya, and it is our desire that will get us out. So though Maya is very strong, because it has to be strong, in order for us to try to experience something that isn't real, meaning being separated from Krishna. It's not possible to be separated from Krishna. He is everywhere. Just like if you jump into a pool, it's not possible not to be wet. It would take some very strong illusion to not become wet. Similarly, it's not possible to be said. I'm just repeating in different ways to illustrate the point. So the experience with the material nature or lack thereof is simply due to our desires. So yes, that is it's almost comical that how much we miss this.
Now I understand, Prabhuji, that we are saying Maya is strong and all that. We had that verse also 7.14. So now understanding Maya is strong, yes. And why is Maya strong? I feel now I'm understanding the fact. Because since we are actually surrounded by Krishna and all that, and we are forgetting, so Maya has to be stronger than that. So much it has to be overwhelming. Only then we are able to forget Krishna. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. And
so that is the reason why it's been given that power.
And that's why Prabhupada says we must declare war on Maya. Not out of animosity with Maya Devi, she is simply serving Krishna. But war of her influence upon us because it's so strong. That immediately we hear this chapter, we read these verses, and as soon as we log off and go on, we again forget, I am not this body. Right? It happens. So we must respect the potency of Maya, but appreciate the superior potency of Krishna. Don't underestimate the enemy. And of course, Maya Devi is not our enemy. We say that figuratively, not literally, because she is also the divine energy. Daivi Hesha Gunamayi. Right? It's a divine energy. But we want to become free from her influence, so we can become under the influence of Yoga Maya, the superior form of Maya. Right? This is Mahamaya. Yoga Maya is what facilitates very sweet, deep relationships with Krishna. I'm going on to a tangent for a second. But as much as Maya in the material world creates the feeling of separation from Krishna, that much more Yoga Maya intensifies the interaction between the soul and Krishna in the spiritual world. Yoga Maya's presence in the spiritual world is so powerful that it creates these deep, deep experiences of love and attraction with Krishna. That is the purpose of Yoga Maya. Mahamaya is to create the appearance of separation from Krishna. So they work in opposite purposes, but they're both very strong. So we hope to become under the influence of Yoga Maya and that's what we see in the residents of Vrindavan. Their love for Krishna is so strong because they even forget he's Krishna. And thus they exhibit an extraordinary relationships with Krishna. So just shift from one Maya to the other.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Yes, it's a little bit quiet. If you can speak a little bit.
In one of the Prabhupada clip, Prabhupada is talking with the Christian preacher about not to eat non-veg, be non-violence. So in that the preacher explained that only human pieces is the real pieces. Rest of all are not real.
Yeah.
So God made all that for our enjoyment.
Yeah.
So I just remember by thinking like this, Krishna is saying clearly that there is only spirit, only matter.
Yeah.
There is no other thing. Everything which has the movable is spirit. It's so simple.
And that's what's the danger of when we come up with our own analysis, right?
Yeah.
We think God made only the human species, the rest are for our enjoyment. That's just one's own conclusion, but that's not reality. And that's a very beautiful conversation. Prabhupada is so extraordinary in that dialogue. I think that was in France where that dialogue took place. But it's almost bewildering how simple it is, right? Yet how pervasive ignorance is around. So this is a gentle slap to all of us.
So it is very open secret. It is.
Yeah.
Even though people do not accept that it's an open secret.
Yeah. And it's simple. We should always never lose sight of the simplicity. Nature, spirit soul, super soul. We're in the middle. Are we going to associate with super soul or nature, body? We have a choice, up or down. We know the results of each. Now we have to decide what to do. That is our free will.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you. Hare
And
Hare
Prabhuji,
Krishna.
sorry, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead,
Thank
Michael.
you for- Thank you, Hare Krishna Prabhu. Thank you so much, as always, for taking us so nicely through this wonderful Bhagavad Gita. Can we make a very brief distinction and difference between the actual self, the jiva, and the mind? Because the self is free will and the desire, and the body is a mechanism to carry this out. So is the mind then just the interface between the two that is separate from the actual self, or is it kind of a part of the self, or can we make this distinction probably?
Yeah, it's a nice question, because when we understand those different functional components, then we can see how they all interrelate. So the mind is part of the body. So it's within the material realm, right? So it's Kshetra. The mind is one of the 24 elements. So it is a material machinery to perform a certain function. So The mind, the intelligence, and the false ego are all part of the subtle body. But it's still part of the body, the kshetra. The gross body, the earth, air, fire, water, and ether, that we can see, touch, feel. But the subtle body, mind, intelligence, false ego, still within body, still within 24 elements, but we don't see it, but we can experience it, right? Thus it's subtle. Subtle versus gross. Those, all 8 components are distinct or separate from the soul. The soul is independent of the body. And again, the mind is part of the body, part of the subtle body. And what the mind's function is, what is that machinery? Every piece of machinery has a function to perform. The function of the mind is to store all of the different desires. It is a reservoir of desires. It's a giant database. As we see things, as we hear things, as we taste things, as we touch things, through the senses, we interact with matter. And those desires become stored in the mind. And those desires come up from time to time. They pop up more frequently than not. And the intelligence either makes good decisions about whether to follow the desires of the mind or not. When one does not have intelligence to know who we are, where we are, why we are here, then it begins to answer the whims of the mind. But if intelligence is strong, then it knows when to say no to the mind. And then works under the direction of the soul, who is directing, ultimately, in its spiritual vision. So that's the function of the mind. It is, think of it as a piece of machinery to execute a particular function of the soul's experience in the material world. But the mind is not an enemy, nor is it a friend. It is dependent on how it's used, and that's what we saw in the 6th chapter. The mind is a friend when it's controlled by the higher intelligence and the direction of the soul. Then it's a friend. Because what else is stored in the mind? What desires? Desires of Krishna consciousness. Right? Desires of serving the Lord. Memories of Krishna. But if the mind is uncontrolled, then it's an enemy. Enemy because it leads to a very degraded condition where the jiva remains entrapped within the bodies for eternity. So the mind is neither friend nor enemy. It's based on how it's used. Piece of machinery. A knife. A knife is neither good or bad. In the hands of a surgeon, it's great. It can save a life. And in the hands of a criminal, it can kill a life. But a knife is neither good nor bad. It's how it's used. Similarly, that's the mind. Is that okay, Prabhu?
That was excellent, Prabhu. Thank you so much. So the evidence of this is why when the jiva transmigrates to another body, he gets a new set of mind suitable for that body, higher intelligence or lower intelligence, depending on the species.
Okay, so let's take that further. That's going to be explained here coming up. That actually, so when the jiva goes to the next body, it carries with it, or it is carried by, actually, technically, the mind, intelligence, and false ego. So the subtle body remains connected to the jiva throughout its entire existence in the material world. So it sheds its gross body, but the subtle body carries it to the next gross body. So the desires of the mind are what carry the soul to the next body. And that is why Krishna said in the 8th chapter, right, how to attain the supreme? Yamyam vapi smaram bhavam. That whatever you think about, that you will achieve. So the mind and intelligence and false ego that we have, it's been with us since the beginning of our presence in the material world. But because Krishna is apahanam, he is the source of our forgetfulness. We forget our past lives. And that is actually his blessing, so that we can have some semblance of sanity. But actually, this mind that we have, we've had since the beginning of our interactions with the material world. It is only the gross bodies that are changed. And ultimately, when the spirit soul relinquishes both the gross and subtle body and returns back home to the spiritual world, does one gain their true, pure spiritual intelligence and mind. So that is the transmigration, the detail of that transmigration.
Thank you, Prabhu. You answered my next question too. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Balika Mataji, you had another question or comment?
Yeah, two things. Actually, one more question now after like Prabhu has asked this question. So we know that subtle body is carried forward in the next body that we take in. So if that is the case, intelligence is a part of it. So here we are talking only that spiritual intelligence is carried forward, obviously. So the intelligence that we gain, which is being stored also, the material intelligence for certain things. So why that is not being carried forward is because that is related to the matter, but still it is going in our intelligence, isn't it? Going in the mind. So why don't we have that material intelligence then? For example, why Einstein, when he's born, why he's not getting that knowledge, and why only the spiritual part is being carried forward? Because intelligence, then you should be carrying forward the whole thing, right?
So based on our karma, the level of intelligence that's available to us is defined. So the intelligence, the consciousness of the tree is different than the human, right? We can just take two somewhat extreme examples. So based on one's karma, the availability to utilize that intelligence is defined. Because in that body, in that kshetra, it has it's almost like a governor, a limiter to how much of that intelligence can be utilized. So, but it's not lost per se, but it can become subdued. But we know in the story of Bharat Maharaj, in the body of the deer, he retained his consciousness that he was a devotee. Not forgetting what had happened and how he had become entrapped by attraction to the deer. It was a great blessing. And thus he remained as a deer in that, vicinity, and then came back, of course, as Jada Bharat, and became mindful not to make that mistake again. Right? So there is some opportunity by the blessings of Krishna for that intelligence to, transcend the ordinary intelligence of whatever kshetra we have acquired. But the kshetra has like a limiter in terms of how much intelligence you go. Just like, I'll try to make another example. If you have a light and you have it covered with some cloth, based on the thickness of that cloth, only a certain amount of light will be perceivable through that cloth. Right? So based on the type of kshetra, it restricts, limits the ability to utilize the intelligence. And that is based on our karma. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yes, Prabhu. Thank you so much. Yeah, and small comment was that when you were explaining about that we have a choice to make whether we can associate with the spiritual energy of Krishna or the material energy of Krishna, then we make a decision. So that's why I think the jiva is living entity is called the marginal energy. That's the reason why, because we have an option whether to go this way or the other way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because actually it is superior energy, but it becomes marginal by its choice to associate with matter. Good connection of different points. Anything else? Okay. If not, we'll meet again next week. Thank you so much. We'll begin chapter 4 chapter 14, which is the modes of material nature. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnava.